Welcome to Survival Crafts. This is a show where we like to share some how-tos in the world of traditional skills, prepping, survival, and even some homesteading skills. So if you've been looking for that stuff, you're on the right channel. This is show number 7 and I'm your host, Brenda Holder. Last video we worked on some sewing techniques. That was video number 6. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you take a look at that before you view this video. We're going to post a link for you just down below in the description bar. In this video, we're going to be focusing a little bit more on doing some beadwork. I believe on the last video I said that I was going to be teaching some loom techniques, but I've decided not to. There are so many videos out there on how to work with a loom. And in later shows, I'm going to be showing you how to work with a traditional loom. So I decided to skip that one for this video. In this video, I'm going to be showing you some great techniques on how to do loom work without a loom. It's pretty neat, so stay tuned. I wanted to show you some examples of off-loom beading, which is also called bead weaving. And this particular kind that I'm showing you right now in camera, this is known as square stitch. Square stitch is pretty much identical to loom weaving. The only difference is that this is done without the benefit of a loom. That's what we're going to learn today. But let me show you a couple more things that you can do with square stitch. It's very versatile. I'll just move that one out of the way. Here's another example of square stitch. You can actually get all kinds of really incredible and fun shapes if you want to spend a little bit of extra time creating a bead pattern for yourself. And this one I made into a bracelet as well. And then finally, I'll show you one more piece. And this is actually a little bit of a mixture of different things. This is a ceremonial piece. And I'll just run it along underneath the camera so you can see everything that you can do with it. For the most part, I've actually used square stitch. So it's a combination of square stitch, brick stitch, fringing, and three-dimensional peyote. This part right here is where the square stitch is. This triangular piece facing away, this is actually called brick stitch. It looks very similar, but you'll see in later videos it's very different. And then of course, all of this loose stuff right here, this is fringing. And finally, you can see this nice big puffy piece here. This is peyote stitch. And this is three-dimensional. We're going to be taking a look at some forms of peyote stitch on the next video, just to help with applique and decoration. So those are some of the things that you can do with square stitch. Now let's take a look at what we're going to need in order to do today's project. Of course, our scissors. And I'm going to show you something that is new, and this is called a thread burner or a thread zap. And I'll explain that a little bit later. You're going to need, of course, some thread. And this is Nymo thread. I'll talk about this and a few others in a moment. You will need some seed beads. I'm going to be using 3 different colors, but these are a seed bead in size 11. I'm also going to be using a size 11 beading needle. And you're going to need some conditioner. And I also use some fire line. So I'll discuss these in a few minutes. Go ahead, gather these up, and let's get started. I want to talk about thread for a minute. There are many different types of thread that you can actually use for beadwork. And I may not be the best seamstress in the world, and I'm not very good at clothing design itself, but I am most definitely a very good hand sewer, and I would consider myself an expert at that, as well as a beadworker. And over the years I've learned lots about beading. Lots of it is self-taught, and there's lots of little tricks and things I've learned about beading, and that includes thread. Now, one thing I've learned the hard way is that no matter what thread you use, it absolutely is going to tangle, especially if you don't condition it. And there's a lot of thread conditioners out there. One of my favorite ones to use is beeswax. You can even use a beeswax candle. It doesn't have to come in a fancy container like this one. Candles will work just well. I've also used lip salve. That seems to work well too, but I don't use it if I'm beading directly onto hide or cloth because it could stain it with the oil. So let's take a look at a few different types of thread that you can use in beadwork. This first one is known as wildfire. And I'll just pull a little bit out for you. You can see it's got a pretty good thickness to it. It's a very sturdy thread. It's very, very strong, and it's one I like to use when I'm making jewelry, especially if it's a type of jewelry that I want to be absolutely certain that it's going to hold against the wear and tear that jewelry will go through inevitably. The next one is something that's known as fireline, and I'll show you just from the side here a little bit. And this one comes in crystal as well as smoke. So a couple of different colors to it. Now, the thickness of fireline, although I'll move this one for a moment, you can see that, or if you'll observe here, I think down at the bottom it does tell you what the thickness is. Generally it's 0.15 millimeters. And let me just pull this out a little bit, because I want to show you a comparison. Essentially, this, you can, it's a little bit hard to see perhaps, but because it is so thin, and I'm going to pull my fireline out, or my wildfire out, and the wildfire itself, you should notice, is quite a bit thicker than this one, although they're both 0.15 millimeter. So you have to just watch the thread that you're using and use the one that goes through your needle easiest. That's the best advice I can probably give you. I don't really have a preference for either one of these. It really just depends on what I'm going to be doing with it. Now let's take a look at the Nymo, and that's this nice big spool here, and you can see a trace of the thread itself, so it too is relatively thick. This is the one that I like to use if I were to work with a loom, which I don't anymore. I prefer to use square stitch now. But on the odd occasion, if I'm teaching classes, then this is the thread that I prefer to use. It's also one that I prefer to use if I'm doing earrings that have fringes on them. I'll do the earrings themselves with the wildfire, and then I'll do the fringing with the Nymo, just because it's a little bit more flexible. It is the worst thread for tangling, and it frays, but it still works really well. And if you condition it with the beeswax, that's even more helpful. It can be a little bit tricky to put this onto a needle because it's very floppy in comparison to the other types of thread. But one little trick I use, if all you have is thread, one of the tricks I use is I'll put a little bit of nail polish right on the end just to stiffen it up, to make it easier to go into the needle better. The one other benefit about Nymo is that it does cut quite easily with scissors. This stuff can sometimes be a challenge. Sometimes it's pretty easy to cut, like right now, but often I find it very challenging to cut through with scissors, especially when I'm trying to do a beading project. And that's when I like to use my thread burner. And it's really easy. It's got a little button on the side, little wires here that do heat up. And it's pretty easy, just pressing the button. It gets pretty hot, and it will actually slice through the wildfire and the fire line much easier than scissors will. Now, one of the little tricks that I learned is that fire line and beading thread in general can be pretty expensive. This one, you'll see the little fish on it. I actually went to the fishing store to get this one. It's 300 yards. It's exactly the same thing as the beading thread you get. It's just in a little bit of a different container. It's made by the same company. It's called Fireline, and it is also crystal. Various beading threads will come in 4 pounds, 6 pound, 8 pound, just like fishing line does. I typically stay in the 4 to 6 pound range just because that I really trust this stuff. I know it's not going to break. Now, throughout this show, as well as the next one, when it comes time to add more thread, and believe me, we're going to be using a lot, I will show you several different ways to add more thread. And there's one particular trick that's my favorite one, which I will show you at some point in time. Now, the needle and thread itself, putting thread onto a needle, let me just use a white backing here so you can see this hopefully a little bit easier. Threading beading needles can be the bane of anybody's existence, especially beading needles. They've got tiny, tiny little eyes. One of the tricks I like to use is this has a little gold eye, so it makes it a bit easier to see. When you're going to be putting your thread through the needle, especially fire line, sometimes you have to pinch the end with your fingernails just to flatten it a little bit because they're a little bit round, so it's hard to put them through that little needle there. Okay, let's take a look at some of the bead needles that we're going to be using. And it's probably a good idea for me to explain to you about the different sizing. If you'll notice here, there's a series of numbers, 10, 11, 13, 16, and these refer to the size of the needle itself, to the width. It's not so much describing the length. In fact, you can get much shorter size 10s and longer 11s, etc. Really, it's talking about the thickness of the needle itself. And the 10 is slightly thicker than the 11. And it may be a bit difficult to see. The 13 and the 16 look as though they are a fairly similar size, and they are. The 16 is just a tiny bit thinner than what the 13 is. There are also size 12 needles. I don't have an example of one at the moment, but I tend to really stick mostly with either a size 10 or a size 11 beading needle. And depending on the type of beads that I use, sometimes I may go to a 12 or a 13 just because they're a little bit thinner to work with. Now, on the last video, we had a look at all of the Glover's needles, and I will show you an example of what they look like when they are next to the bead needles. Hopefully what you should notice is these teeny tiny little eyes where the thread's going to have to go in comparison to the Glover's needles. And of course we have two different sizes here. Although this one is quite a bit smaller, the eye of this needle is far bigger than the beading needle, so it is an awful lot easier to thread them, especially these really big guys here. One thing to note about your beading needles is that even with the sort of thicker size 11s and 10s, beading needles do break. It's a fact of life, and I go through quite a few of them. Luckily, like the Glover's needles, they're not that costly, so it's absolutely fine. Just expect that you're probably going to be breaking beading needles. Okay, so those are the needles. Not all beads are created equal, and there are these ones that I've got here, the cheap dollar store brands, and there's also very expensive beads that you can buy at specialty bead stores. depending on the beadwork that you desire to do or how much you think you're going to get into it, will really determine what kind of beads that you get. Now these cheap dollar store brands, they work just fine. However, you will spend a lot of time culling them and trying to find ones that are equal size. But if you don't intend to get into anything too fancy, they might actually work out really well for you. And they are a good bead to practice with. So let's take a look at these. You can, if I pick this up, I'll pick up a few different ones. There's some very different shapes in amongst the same beads. So that's what I mean by culling them. You want to remove the ones that are not going to work for you. For the most part, I'll just pick up a few of them. They're going to be reasonably similar in size, and we got this one on the end that is of a different size and shape. And that's what you get when you have really cheap beads. So those are kind of the dollar store or even the Walmart brand beads. So I'll get rid of those guys. Actually, I'll just move them out of the way on my tray here. The other ones, these ones are a size 10, and these ones are, I believe, a check type bead, and I'll talk about those later. For the most part, these ones also, you will have to cull some of them, but you will not have quite the same radical differences that you will with the dollar store brands. Now I'm going to talk about other types of beads in just a few minutes, but first let's take a look at some bead sizes. Okay, like needles, bead sizes are very similar. The smaller the number, the larger the bead. I believe it comes down to how many beads will fit in a particular measurement. For example, it will take 10 beads to fit into a certain space, and those would be called a size 10. But smaller beads in the same space might take 11 or 15 of them to fit in, which would make them size 11 or 15. Very similar to the way gauge works with shotguns. This is our size 2 bead, and it's got a very, very large hole. The next size down is a size 6, still a pretty big hole. Size 8, again, that's pretty big. Size 11 is a really nice size to work with. You can make some very pretty designs with it. And then size 15 is also a nice one. And these are all known as seed beads. I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But we've got a couple of different styles here. These are known as delica beads or cylinder. And they've got fairly large holes for being fairly small beads, but they're shaped like a cylinder rather than a round donut kind of thing. And just like any other bead, the smaller the number, the larger the bead. So here we've got a delica size 11 compared to the delica size 10. It's really quite a size difference. Now, I already mentioned the different types of beads, such as the delica. So they don't come in just different sizes. Of course, they're going to be different shapes. Some of them will have 1 hole, some 2, some 3, and even 4 hole beads. So the seed beads typically are round beads, and these all are considered seed beads. So the size 2, 6, 8, 11, and 15 are all known as seed beads. And seed beads actually came from the fur trade. Some of them, from my understanding, are actually steel glass, and some are made of plastic or even just a plastic coat. And then, of course, the delica beads, as I already said, are the cylinder shape. And these ones I use in a slightly different type of bead weaving called peyote stitch. You can use all beads for all different types of projects. It's just that their shape will make it a little bit easier according to the different types of bead weaving that you're going to do. We also have to take a look at patterns. Now this is something I did on an Excel sheet. They're the same pattern. I just made this same one larger so it could be a little bit easier for you to see on the screen. In order to do on loom or off loom beading, it's good to create a pattern that you can actually follow. And there's tons of free patterns you can get off the internet. There's great books out there, etc. So I'm not going to talk about patterns at all. Just so you know, this is the pattern I intend to follow when we start doing the square stitch. There are a lot of different types of off loom bead weaving techniques that I can show you, but I'm going to stick to the square stitch for this one. Today's show I'm going to be doing square stitch as just a separate woven piece on its own, and then in part 2 of this series, so the next video, I'm going to stitch it onto a piece of hide, since a short woven piece is fairly easy to stitch on after you've finished weaving the pattern. So far I have not found anyone else who does square stitch the way I do it. I think mine's a little simpler, and it's also a lot sturdier than the ones that I've seen. Many other videos have an extra step to reinforce their work, but I incorporate it all into a single step, so I reinforce my work as I go without any extra time having to go back over the beadwork over and over again. Now to begin beading, I'm going to do something called putting a stop bead on, and that is a larger bead or any different bead, any different color, different shape bead that is not the same bead that you're going to be using in your project, because sometimes you can accidentally incorporate that without wanting to. So to put a stop bead on, I'm going to just put it onto my needle. And I've already threaded my needle, and I've used the 4-pound crystal fire line. So I'm going to pull it down towards the end, and all I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just tie a knot onto this bead. Some people will run their needle back through the where the tail end is coming out, and they'll run it back through this way. Because this bead is pretty big, I'm just going to tie a knot. It will make it easier for me to keep it on there. Now what the stop bead is going to do is it will prevent all of my other beads from falling off when I put them on. Okay, so I've got my stop bead on. Now what I'm going to do is the very first row consists of always picking up all of the beads that you need. So in my pattern I need 7 blue beads. Now, a lot of people are able to just scoop up the bead with their needle and not use their finger. Unfortunately, I'm not one of those people. I can't do that. And I'm going to take them all the way to the end of the row and bump them up more or less onto the stop bead. Now, if they wiggle down a little bit, that's not an issue. We'll be removing that stop bead anyway, and it doesn't have to stay tight on that. So I'm coming out of this bead right here. And the rules that I follow, or the way I do it, is at the beginning of every row, I always pick up 2 beads every time. So to follow my color pattern, I'm going to go, this is my first row, now I'm going to go into my second row. And I'll be picking up 2 beads. My goal with those 2 beads is to have them sitting beside these 2 bottom ones right here. So I want them to sit beside them. In order to do that, I need to make a circle. Pick up my 2 beads. One is a red and one is a blue one. So there's my red and blue. Now, in order to get them to sit beside these 2, I have to come back down these 2 bottom beads right here. So that's what I'll do. I'll put my needle through. Now I'm going to cover these beads with my fingers so I can hold them steady. And I'm just simply going to pull through. So now you see the red and the blue bead are sitting beside the first 2 in that row. Now in order to continue on with this row, my thread has to be coming out of that blue bead. So I'll put my needle up through those 2 beads. I'm going to put my finger over to hold them, and I'll pull my thread all the way through. And I'll put that down so you can see easier. And so I'm ready to put the next bead on. So I'll pick up one bead at a time now. So my blue bead, I'll just slide that down. So what I need to do now, my goal is to put the other blue bead I just picked up on top of this bead, but beside this bead. So in order to do that, I have to come down this blue bead, so kind of continuing that circle. But here's where I reinforce. Not only will I go through that blue bead, I'm going to go through the one below it, and then that way I'll come up through this bead and the new one I added. So let me show you what that looks like. So if I slide my new bead down, I can sit it right there. I'm going to take my needle, I'm going to bring it down through the third bead and the second bead from the bottom, and I'm going to pull, there we are. Okay, so it's coming out of the bottom of this bead. Now I have to go up these two beads to get back up into place to put on my next bead. So let me just show you that again. So I'll pick up another blue bead, slide it all the way down there, and I'll get my hands out of the way as soon as I can. So now it's going to be sitting next to this bead, and I want to connect it to that bead as well as the one below. So once again, I'm going to go through the bead beside it and the one below that one. And I'll just pull my thread through. Now I need to come back up through the two beads, one of them being the one I just added. And I'll pull that through, and those are attached now. Once again, I'm going to go through the bead that I want it to be beside. And then I'm going to bring the needle up 2 beads because my thread is coming out of this one. I want to go right across to the bead beside it underneath and come up those 2 beads. So I'm ready to put another one on. So we've got one more blue bead to do. So once again, I'm going to want it to sit beside the second one from the top. I've got it on my needle. So I need to put my needle into the second one from the top and then the one below that too. And now I'm going to pull my thread, and that anchors the bead beside the one I want it to go beside. My thread is coming out of this bead, so that means I need to go straight across to the next bead here, and that's 2 beads down. Needle through the top 2 beads, and I can pull that tight. And now the final bead on the second row is going to be a red one. And this one I will just go straight in through the top 2 beads. Pull my thread. My stopper bead's getting in the way. I'm just going to pull my thread, and it sits beside the one I want it to. And once again, I'm going to come up through those 2 beads. At this point now, everything is anchored in place, and I'm going to just simply pull the stopper bead off. It doesn't need to be there anymore. So, now with square stitch, it's easy to always work from the bottom going to the top, and because this is an equal pattern, I can do that without worrying that I will change it. So I'm just going to flip my whole piece of work around. So I've now got 2 rows on. And I'm going to do one more row for you. It does get easier after the second and third row, and then I will continue that on, all the rest of it off camera, so you can see what that looks like. So again, I want 2 beads at the beginning of my new row. So this one calls for 2 red ones. And again, I want to go and make a circle. I've picked up 2 beads. That means I have to go through 2 beads on this side. So it's the 2 bottom beads. I pull my thread, anchor those beside, and then I need my thread to go back up through those beads. And now they're anchored to the ones beside them. And now I will just continue slow time without any more talking, just showing you the process. Okay, and I will put on my last bead of this row. And that's the first 3 rows done. I can now flip this over and continue on with my pattern. Remember, at the beginning of every row, you're going to be adding on 2 beads. Okay, so I'm going to cut the camera for now. I'm going to finish this whole section, and as I'm putting the last few beads on the whole section, I'll bring the camera back on and show you what to do next. And I will put my little project there. And then I will get my bead pattern. And really all I've done is I've followed whatever the bead pattern has said here. So I needed on the first row 7 beads, which I picked that up. And then I needed a red bead at either end. And then just followed exactly what the pattern said. So each square representing 1 bead. And these are really easy patterns that you can develop on Excel or even draw on a sheet of graph paper. So that's just very basic information on how to follow that, the pattern. Now I will do one more row because I need to show you how I will attach a new piece of thread. So let me take my needle off of this one. And what I will do is I get my new piece of thread, and I will attach it to my needle. I'll just pull a little bit through. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to attach the 2 ends. And keep in mind, this is just simply one way of doing this. There are lots of ways. A lot of people have thought that this was a silly way of doing it. I have never had a problem with this. It has always held. Sometimes when you're first working with the knot, it might break apart, but that's because you didn't melt the ends down, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. So I'm going to do a square knot, left over right and under, and then I'm going to do right over left and under. And I'm just going to pull those two together. See if I got that right. Yes. So now what I want to do is I want to take those two ends and I'm going to melt them. And this is usually, if this knot's going to fail, it's usually at the very beginning, and it means you just didn't melt it down enough. So I'm going to melt those two down a little. There we go. Hopefully that one will work. It's a little bit soft. So it's important to melt both sides down. Try to get a little molten ball on the end there. And now all I have to do is just pull. And those two will join together right there. Now, even though there's a knot there, I can still actually get my beads through it. Now, if I was working with a much smaller size bead, like a 15, then this is very difficult to get through, but I still have done it. So I will pick up some blue beads, and when I first start this, working with this, I like to, what I call, tame the knot down. So what that means is these two beads, I'm going to pull them past that knot. I'm going to pull them just past that knot, and you can see there's the knot there, and I slipped those past that knot quite easily. Now if I'm going to continue on, then I will just put my needle through the two bottom beads like I have been doing the whole time. And sometimes you just have to tug a little bit to get that knot through, but it works really well. I have never had these knots come apart or break. There's a lot of force of them pulling against each other, and the melted ends stop them from slipping past each other. So that's how I add more thread onto a project when I need more. It is the best way to save thread, especially if you need to be thrifty. There's almost zero wastage, except for if you've had to cut any pieces off, but it will also stop you from having to weave through your work and do a whole bunch of half-hitch knots. So for me, it's a little bit more convenient. Okay, well that concludes the first part of our two-part series on bead weaving. Next video, I'm going to be showing you how to do that same square stitch directly onto some hide. And I'm going to also show you a couple of other different methods for beading onto hide called direct applique. And hopefully on this video, I made it clear enough for you to be able to understand square stitch. If you have your own preferred style of bead weaving, then by all means, use that one. Until next time, thank you very much for watching. And if you like what we do, please post us on your website, like us on Facebook, subscribe to us, leave us some comments, and we'd like it if you share with your friends as well. If there's anything that you think that you would like to see us do, please send us a comment in the box below or send us a private message, and we'll be happy to try and make that happen for you. We'll see you on the next video.